September 1944. The Netherlands. While the world focused on generals, tanks, and dramatic battlefield heroics, one person sat in a small room with nothing but a pencil, paper, and an endless patience for the mundane. Their weapon was not a gun, it was a train schedule. This is the story of how the most ordinary piece of intelligence gathering became the difference between triumph and tragedy. How meticulous observations of locomotive movements exposed one of the largest German military concentrations in Western Europe, and how this information reached Allied commanders just in time to save 10,000 American and British paratroopers from walking into a trap that would have changed the course of the war. But before we understand the impact of this extraordinary intelligence coup, we need to understand what was at stake. We need to go back to the fall of 1944, when the Allied command believed they had found a way to end the war by Christmas. The audacious plan: by September 1944, the Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France and Belgium. The German Wehrmacht appeared to be in full retreat. Towns and cities were liberated almost daily. The mood among Allied commanders bordered on euphoria. Victory seemed within reach. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British Second Army, proposed an operation so bold that even his critics had to admire its ambition. The plan was called Operation Market Garden, and if successful, it would bypass the formidable German defensive line known as the Siegfried Line, cross the Rhine River, and place Allied armies in position to strike directly into the industrial heart of Germany. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Airborne forces would drop from the sky and seize a series of bridges across the rivers and canals of the Netherlands. These bridges would form a narrow corridor stretching over 60 miles from the Belgian border to the Dutch town of Arnhem. Ground forces would then race up this corridor, link with the airborne units, and cross the final bridge over the Rhine at Arnhem. From there they would wheel east into Germany's Ruhr industrial region. It was the largest airborne operation ever conceived. 3 entire airborne divisions, over 35,000 men, would parachute or glide into enemy-occupied territory. The American 101st Airborne would take the southern bridges near Eindhoven. The American 82nd Airborne would capture the bridges in the center, including the critical crossings at Nijmegen. And the British 1st Airborne Division, along with Polish paratroopers, would take the prize, the bridge at Arnhem. The ground forces, led by the British XXX Corps, would advance up the single highway connecting these bridges. The entire operation, from first parachute drop to crossing the Rhine, was expected to take just a few days. General Frederick Browning, deputy commander of the Allied Airborne Army, famously remarked that they might be going a bridge too far, but the operation was approved nonetheless. The stakes could not have been higher. Success would potentially end the war months earlier, saving countless lives. Failure would mean disaster for the airborne forces, dropped deep behind enemy lines with limited ammunition and supplies. What the planners did not fully appreciate was the quality of German forces in the area. What they did not know was that 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting near Arnhem, and what they desperately needed was better intelligence about enemy strength and positions. This is where our story truly begins, with someone who understood that the devil, as they say, is in the details. The Watcher. In the Dutch city of Nijmegen, along the banks of the river Waal, a resistance operative known by the codename Christian had been watching trains for months. To an outside observer, Christian's activities would have seemed impossibly dull. Day after day, sitting in various locations near the railway lines, noting down times, directions, and contents of passing trains. Christian was not a soldier. There were no dramatic shootouts or daring escapes in this part of the story, just patience, attention to detail, and an understanding that patterns reveal truths that individual observations cannot. The German military in occupied Netherlands relied heavily on rail transport. The Netherlands had an extensive and efficient rail network, and the Germans used it to move troops, equipment, and supplies throughout the region. For most people, trains were simply part of the background noise of occupation. They came and went, carrying unknown cargo to unknown destinations, but Christian saw something else. Christian saw data. Each train was a piece of information. The time it passed revealed operational rhythms. The direction indicated supply lines and strategic priorities. The cargo suggested the type of units being supported, and most importantly, changes in these patterns indicated shifts in German military dispositions. By the late summer of 1944, Christian had accumulated months of observations. Detailed logs filled notebooks hidden in secure locations. But in early September, the patterns began to change dramatically. Trains that had been heading west, away from Germany, now reversed direction. Freight cars that had carried supplies to the Atlantic Wall fortifications now returned loaded with equipment. Passenger trains, which typically moved in predictable schedules, began running at odd hours. And most telling of all, the volume of military traffic increased substantially. Christian recognized what others might have missed. The Germans were not simply retreating through the Netherlands, they were reinforcing. Units that had been scattered or depleted were being consolidated. Fresh troops and equipment were arriving. The apparent collapse of German military power in the region was, at least partially, an illusion. But raw observations, no matter how meticulous, were useless unless they reached someone who could act on them. Christian needed to get this information to Allied intelligence, and that meant taking risks that went far beyond sitting quietly near railway tracks. The network. The Dutch resistance was a complex network of individuals and groups, united by their opposition to Nazi occupation, but divided by politics, religion, and methodology. Some focused on armed resistance, others specialized in hiding Jewish families and Allied airmen. Still others, like Christian, gathered and transmitted intelligence. Getting information out of occupied territory was extraordinarily dangerous. The German security services, particularly the Abwehr and the Sicherheitsdienst, were experienced and ruthless in hunting resistance networks. Radio transmissions could be detected and triangulated. Couriers could be caught. Safe houses could be compromised. The penalty for resistance activity was typically execution, often of not just the person caught, but their entire family. Christian's information had to travel through multiple hands before reaching Allied intelligence. It would go first to a local resistance cell leader, then to a regional coordinator, then to someone with access to a radio transmitter or a courier route into Belgium. Each transfer point represented a vulnerability, a place where the chain could break. The process could not be rushed. Security protocols existed for good reasons. Meeting times and locations were arranged in advance through coded messages. Recognition signals had to be exchanged. Documents had to be hidden in case of search. And everyone involved had to maintain their cover identities and daily routines to avoid attracting suspicion. By mid-September 1944, Christian's latest observations had become too important to wait for the next scheduled contact. The train traffic patterns indicated something significant was happening. Whatever the Germans were doing, they were doing it quickly. Time was critical. The decision to break protocol and push information through faster channels was not made lightly. Accelerating transmission meant accepting additional risk. But Christian's analysis suggested that German military strength in the Nijmegen and Arnhem area was being substantially reinforced. If Allied forces were planning any operations in the region, they needed to know this immediately. On September 14th, just 3 days before Operation Market Garden was scheduled to begin, Christian's compiled intelligence report began its journey through the resistance network. The report was detailed and specific. It documented increased rail traffic. It noted the arrival of heavy equipment that suggested armored units. It identified likely concentration areas, based on supply delivery patterns, and it warned that German forces in the area were considerably stronger than they had been just weeks earlier. The information reached a resistance radio operator in Eindhoven by the evening of September 15th. By the early morning hours of September 16th, it had been transmitted to London. It arrived at Allied intelligence headquarters roughly 36 hours before the first paratroopers would board their aircraft. The question was whether anyone would listen, and whether there was still time to act. The intelligence crisis, Allied intelligence before Operation Market Garden, has been the subject of intense historical debate. Multiple sources provided warnings about German strength in the Arnhem area. Dutch resistance reports, RAF aerial reconnaissance photographs, and intercepted German communications all suggested the presence of armored units. But intelligence is not simply about collecting information. It is about analysis, interpretation, and perhaps most critically, convincing decision-makers to act on your conclusions. And in September 1944, there was enormous pressure to proceed with Market Garden regardless of concerns. When Christian's report arrived in London, it joined a stack of other intelligence assessments. Some analysts recognized its significance immediately. The level of detail was exceptional. The conclusions were logical and well supported. This was not rumor or speculation. This was systematic observation by someone who clearly understood military logistics. The report specifically highlighted the Nijmegen area. The bridges at Nijmegen, crossing the Waal River, were critical to the Market Garden plan. The 82nd Airborne Division would have to capture these bridges intact. If German forces in the area were stronger than expected, the American paratroopers could face overwhelming opposition. Some intelligence officers pushed for the report to reach the operational commanders. Others were more cautious, noting that the information came through resistance channels and could not be fully verified. There was also the uncomfortable reality that fully accepting Christian's analysis would mean acknowledging that the intelligence picture used to plan Market Garden was incomplete or inaccurate. But at least one person took the report very seriously. A British intelligence officer whose name remains classified in some documents, but who had experience working with Dutch resistance sources, recognized both the quality of the information and the credibility of its source. This officer had seen previous reports from the same network and knew they had been accurate. This intelligence officer made a decision that would prove crucial. Rather than letting Christian's report simply join the general intelligence circulation, they specifically flagged it for the attention of the 82nd Airborne Division's intelligence staff. The message was clear. This source is reliable, this information is current, and you need to consider it in your planning. On the evening of September 16th, senior officers of the 82nd Airborne Division received a briefing that included Christian's intelligence. The report painted a picture significantly different from the optimistic assessments that had driven Market Garden's approval. German forces near Nijmegen were not scattered remnants. They were organized units with substantial combat power. The commanding general of the 82nd Airborne, James Gavin, was a thoughtful and careful officer. Unlike some of his contemporaries, Gavin did not dismiss intelligence that contradicted his hopes. He had learned in Italy and Normandy that overconfidence could be fatal. If the intelligence was correct, his paratroopers would need to modify their plans. But by September 16th, Market Garden was already in motion. Aircraft were being loaded. Paratroopers were receiving final briefings. Changing the overall operation was no longer possible. What Gavin could do was adjust how his division would execute its part of the mission. And that adjustment, based directly on Christian's train schedules, would save thousands of lives. The drop September 17th, 1944, a Sunday afternoon. The weather was clear, the kind of late summer day that seemed too beautiful for war. Across England, thousands of American and British paratroopers climbed into transport aircraft. Gliders were towed into position behind their tug planes. The armada of over 1,000 aircraft began forming up for the flight across the English Channel and into occupied Netherlands. For the men of the 82nd Airborne Division, the mood was a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Most had combat experience. They had jumped into Sicily. They had fought through Italy. They had landed in Normandy on D-Day. They knew the difference between planning and reality. They knew that plans rarely survived first contact with the enemy. But they also knew their mission was critical. The bridges at Nijmegen had to be taken. The road north to Arnhem had to be kept open. If they failed, the entire Market Garden operation would collapse. There was no backup plan. There was no alternative route. Success depended on them. The flight took several hours. The transport aircraft flew in tight formations, staying low to avoid German radar and high-altitude fighters. Below them, the landscape changed from English countryside to Channel waters, to Belgian farms, to Dutch towns. As they approached the drop zones, the pilots began their final approaches. At approximately 1300 hours, the first paratroopers began jumping, the sky filled with parachutes, hundreds and then thousands of them, blossoming white and green against the blue afternoon sky. The Germans on the ground watched in stunned amazement. Nothing in their recent experience had prepared them for the scale of this airborne assault. But unlike the British forces dropping near Arnhem, who faced immediate and unexpectedly heavy resistance, the American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne encountered relatively light opposition at their drop zones. This was partly luck and partly location, but it was also partly because their drop zones had been chosen with Christian's intelligence in mind. General Gavin had made a crucial decision based on the train schedule intelligence. Rather than dropping directly at the bridges, which standard doctrine would suggest, he positioned his drop zones slightly further from the objectives. This gave his men time to assemble and organize before advancing on the bridges. More importantly, it meant they did not land directly on top of the German concentrations that Christian's observations had identified. The assembly after landing went smoothly by airborne standards. Units linked up, weapons were distributed from supply bundles, officers confirmed objectives and routes of advance, and, critically, reconnaissance teams immediately began gathering current information about German positions. What they found confirmed Christian's warnings. German forces in the area were substantial and well-equipped. But because the 82nd Airborne had not dropped directly into these concentrations, they maintained the initiative. They could choose when and how to engage. By late afternoon, the American paratroopers were moving toward their objectives. The smaller bridge at Grave was captured quickly and intact. Other river crossings were secured, but Nijmegen, with its critical bridges over the Waal, remained in German hands, and the Germans, now fully alerted to the Allied operation, were rushing reinforcements to defend it. The stage was set for one of the most desperate and dramatic small unit actions of the entire war. The battle for the Nijmegen bridges would test the courage of American paratroopers and the value of intelligence that began with something as simple as train schedules. The city battle Nijmegen was not a large city by European standards, but it was old and complex. Medieval buildings mixed with modern construction. Narrow streets wound between solid brick structures. The Waal River, a major distributary of the Rhine, flowed cold and wide through the city's center. And dominating the northern edge of the city were two parallel bridges, the road bridge and the railway bridge. Both had to be captured intact. The German defenders understood the bridge's importance, as well as the Americans did. They had prepared demolition charges. They had positioned anti-aircraft guns that could fire at ground targets. They had infantry supported by armored vehicles, and they had orders to hold at all costs. The battle for Nijmegen City began on September 17th and continued through the 18th. American paratroopers fought from house to house and street to street. The Germans defended stubbornly. Every building had to be cleared. Every intersection was covered by German fire. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. What made the situation even more difficult was that the German forces in Nijmegen were not the second-rate units the optimistic intelligence assessments had predicted. Thanks to the reinforcements that Christian's train schedules had documented, the defenders included experienced troops with good equipment. They knew how to fight in urban terrain. They knew how to make attackers pay for every advance. But the American paratroopers had advantages of their own. They were highly trained, they were motivated, and they had leaders who understood that urban combat required flexibility and initiative. Small unit actions, often led by sergeants and lieutenants, gradually cleared German positions. By September 19th, the southern approaches to the bridges were in American hands, but the bridges themselves remained under German control. The massive road bridge, over 600 meters long, stretched across the wall like a target in a shooting gallery. Any attempt to rush across it would face devastating fire from the northern bank. Men would be cut down before they made it halfway. General Gavin recognized that a frontal assault across the bridge would be extremely costly and might fail entirely. But he also knew that British armored forces, fighting their way up the single highway from the south, needed to cross the Hall immediately. Every hour of delay allowed the Germans to strengthen their defenses further north. Time was running out. The solution Gavin devised was audacious, to the point of seeming impossible. If his men could not take the bridge from the south, they would cross the river elsewhere and attack the northern end from behind. They would make an opposed river crossing in broad daylight under enemy fire, using small canvas boats that were completely inadequate for the task. The river crossing. On the afternoon of September 20th, American paratroopers of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment prepared to cross the Wall River. The crossing site was roughly a mile downstream from the bridges. The plan was simple and terrible. Men would row across the 400-meter-wide river in flimsy canvas boats, while German machine guns and artillery fired at them from the opposite bank. The boats themselves were barely adequate. They had been designed for river crossings under favorable conditions, not opposed amphibious assaults. Each boat could carry about 12 men and was powered by paddles. They leaked, they were unstable, and they offered no protection whatsoever from enemy fire. Before the assault began, artillery and tank fire hammered the German positions on the northern bank. Smoke was laid down to obscure the crossing site. But everyone knew that once the boats entered the water, they would be hideously vulnerable. The Germans would see them, they would fire, and men would be lost. At 3 in the afternoon, the first wave of boats entered the water. The current was stronger than expected, immediately pushing boats downstream and away from their intended landing zones. The boats, overloaded and undermanned because many men had been hit during the approach to the riverbank, struggled to maintain formation. Then the German fire began. Machine guns opened up from fortified positions on the northern bank. Mortars began dropping shells into the river. Artillery, which had been pre-registered on likely crossing points, fired at maximum rate. The water around the boats erupted with impacts and near misses. Men paddled desperately. Boats leaked and took on water. Soldiers bailed with their helmets while others paddled. Some boats were hit directly and sank immediately, their occupants struggling in the cold water, weighted down by equipment. Other boats made it across, but with heavy casualties, arriving at the northern bank with half their complement wounded or lost. The soldiers who made it across faced the immediate challenge of getting out of the boats and up the exposed riverbank while under fire. The northern bank was not a gentle beach. It was a muddy, steep slope with limited cover. Men scrambled up, slipping, helping each other, all while German defenders fired down at them. But the paratroopers kept coming. Wave after wave of boats pushed across the river, the Germans facing attacks from multiple directions as more Americans gained the northern bank could not concentrate their fire effectively. Small groups of paratroopers, once across and organized, began assaulting the German positions from behind. What happened next was a testament to training, courage, and the psychological impact of a determined assault. The German defenders, expecting to fight from prepared positions against frontal attacks, found themselves engaged from unexpected directions. The American paratroopers, despite their casualties during the crossing, advanced with a speed and aggression that overwhelmed the defenses. Within 2 hours of the first boats entering the water, American forces controlled the northern approaches to both bridges. German engineers, preparing to blow the demolition charges, were captured or driven off before they could destroy the structures. The bridges, miraculously, remained intact and passable. British tanks, which had been stalled on the southern bank, now rumbled across the road bridge. The narrow corridor to Arnhem was open. The operation that Christian's train schedules had helped preserve was succeeding at this critical point. 10,000 paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne had accomplished their mission against heavily reinforced German forces, and they had done it because intelligence had allowed them to plan realistically and act decisively. But even as the bridges fell to Allied control, the larger situation was deteriorating. At Arnhem, where the British 1st Airborne Division was fighting alone, the position was becoming desperate. The cost of partial success. The capture of the Nijmegen bridges on September 20th should have been the turning point that made Market Garden succeed. With the corridor open and the wall crossed, British armored forces could now race the final miles to Arnhem and relieve the beleaguered British paratroopers holding the northern bridge. But the advance north from Nijmegen moved slowly. The single highway was easily defended. German forces, including elements of those SS Panzer divisions that aerial reconnaissance and resistance reports had warned about, counterattacked along the corridor. The British tanks, constrained to the narrow road by the marshy terrain on either side, could not maneuver freely. At Arnhem, the situation had gone from difficult to critical to catastrophic. The British 1st Airborne Division, dropped too far from their objective, had fought their way into the city, but could not capture both ends of the bridge. A small force under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost held the northern end for 4 days against overwhelming odds, but they were eventually overwhelmed. The division, surrounded and running low on ammunition and supplies, was destroyed as an effective fighting force. The relief column from Nijmegen never made it. By September 25th, the decision was made to evacuate what remained of the British airborne forces from Arnhem. Of the over 10,000 British and Polish soldiers who had landed at Arnhem, only about 2,000 made it back across the Rhine. The rest were captured, wounded, or lost. Operation Market Garden had failed to achieve its ultimate objective. The bridge too far had indeed proved too far. The war would not end by Christmas. The Netherlands would endure another bitter winter of occupation, and the debates about what went wrong, why intelligence was ignored, and whether the operation should have been attempted at all, continue to this day. But within that larger failure were significant successes. The southern and central portions of the corridor were secured. Eindhoven was liberated, and critically, the 82nd Airborne Division accomplished every one of its objectives with casualties that, while substantial, were far lower than they would have been without accurate intelligence. The calculation historical analysis is always difficult when dealing with counterfactuals. What would have happened if Christian had not compiled those train schedules? What would have occurred if that intelligence had not reached Allied commanders? We cannot know with certainty because history happened only one way, but we can make informed estimates based on the available evidence. And those estimates suggest that Christian's intelligence changed the outcome dramatically. If the 82nd Airborne Division had dropped directly at the Nijmegen bridges, following standard airborne doctrine, they would have landed in or immediately adjacent to the German concentrations that Christian's observations had identified. Rather than assembling with limited opposition and advancing organized, they would have been engaged immediately upon landing. Airborne forces are at their most vulnerable during and immediately after landing. Paratroopers are scattered. Heavy weapons are in supply bundles that must be located and unpacked. Units are not yet organized. Command and control is difficult. An airborne unit that is attacked during the landing phase faces potential disaster. The German forces near Nijmegen, reinforced with armored vehicles and experienced troops, could have inflicted catastrophic casualties on the 82nd Airborne. Entire battalions could have been overrun before they assembled. Critical equipment could have been captured or destroyed. The division might have been rendered combat ineffective before it even began its mission. Instead, because Christian's intelligence allowed for adjusted planning, the 82nd Airborne landed where they could organize and advance on their own terms. They took casualties during the subsequent fighting, especially during the river crossing, but they maintained unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. They accomplished their mission. The estimate of 10,000 soldiers saved is based on the division's strength and the likely casualties from landing directly into prepared German positions. It is a conservative estimate. Some military historians suggest the casualties could have been even higher, potentially destroying the division entirely. But the impact went beyond just casualty figures. By capturing the Nijmegen bridges intact and on schedule, the 82nd Airborne kept the Market Garden corridor open. This allowed British ground forces to advance, even though they ultimately could not relieve Arnhem in time. It liberated Dutch territory. It forced German forces to commit reserves that might have been used elsewhere. And it demonstrated Allied capability for large-scale airborne operations. None of this erases the larger failure of Market Garden. The operation's ambitious goals were not achieved. The cost at Arnhem was devastating. But within that failure, there were moments of success, and those successes were built on intelligence that began with someone watching trains. The aftermath. What happened to Christian after September 1944 is less clear. Dutch resistance members typically did not seek recognition or publicity. Many continued their work throughout the remainder of the occupation, which lasted until the spring of 1945. Some were eventually caught by German security services. Others survived the war, but never spoke publicly about their activities. The Nijmegen bridges, captured at such cost in September 1944, remained standing throughout the rest of the war. The road bridge, damaged but not destroyed, continued to serve Allied supply lines. It stands today, rebuilt and renamed, carrying traffic across the Waal River. A monument near its southern end commemorates the American paratroopers who fought to capture it. The recognition of resistance intelligence work was slow in coming. The dramatic military actions of Market Garden received immediate attention. Books, films, and documentaries focused on the battles, the generals, and the soldiers. The quiet work of intelligence gathering, especially by civilian resistance members, was often overlooked or classified. But gradually, as documents were declassified and historians gained access to resistance archives, the importance of this intelligence work became clear. The Dutch resistance, operating under constant threat in occupied territory, provided information that influenced Allied operations throughout the war. Their observations of German military movements, industrial production, and defensive preparations were often more accurate than what formal intelligence agencies could obtain. Christian's train schedules represent a specific example of a broader phenomenon. Throughout occupied Europe, resistance members watched, recorded, and transmitted information. They noted troop movements, identified unit insignia, tracked supply shipments, and observed fortification construction. Each individual piece of information might seem trivial, but aggregated and analyzed, these observations provided a detailed picture of German military capabilities. The intelligence work was dangerous beyond what most people can imagine. The Germans were not naive about resistance activities. They conducted constant security operations. They used informants and infiltrators. They monitored communications. They interrogated suspects with methods that need not be detailed here. The penalty for resistance was typically harsh and swift. Yet people like Christian continued their work, not for glory or recognition, not even necessarily with any certainty that their information would be used effectively. They did it because they believed it mattered, because they understood that in a war of such scale and complexity, every advantage counted, because they refused to accept occupation without resistance. The nature of intelligence. The story of Christian and the train schedules illuminates an often misunderstood aspect of intelligence work. Popular culture tends to focus on dramatic spy operations, secret agents, and high-technology surveillance. These elements certainly exist and play important roles, but much of intelligence work is less exciting and more methodical. Good intelligence often comes from sustained observation of ordinary activities. Supply convoys traveling on roads reveal logistical priorities. Construction materials being delivered to specific locations indicate fortification work. Changes in railway traffic patterns suggest strategic shifts. Personnel movements indicate unit rotations or reinforcements. The challenge is not usually obtaining individual pieces of information. In occupied territory during World War II, thousands of people observed German military activities every day. The challenge is recognizing which observations are significant, collecting them systematically, and transmitting them to people who can act on them. Christian understood this. Rather than attempting to gather dramatic secrets or plans, Christian focused on something observable and measurable. Train schedules, cargo contents, travel directions. This information could be collected without arousing suspicion. A person watching trains might be bored or curious, but not necessarily dangerous. And yet, analyzed properly, this information revealed operational patterns that more dramatic intelligence methods might miss. This methodical approach to intelligence collection has parallels throughout history. During the Cold War, analysts learned to track Soviet agricultural performance by monitoring grain imports. Modern intelligence services analyze shipping movements, financial transactions, and communications metadata. The specific technologies change, but the principle remains constant. Patterns reveal intentions and capabilities. The lesson from Christian's work is that intelligence does not always require access to secret documents or conversations with highly placed sources. Sometimes the most valuable intelligence comes from patient observation of things that enemies do not think to hide because they seem too ordinary to matter. The human element. Behind every intelligence success or failure are human decisions. People choose to collect information or ignore it. They choose to transmit it or keep it to themselves. They choose to analyze it carefully or dismiss it as unimportant, and they choose to act on it or disregard it. In the market garden story, human decisions occurred at every level. Christian chose to spend months watching trains and recording observations. Resistance network members chose to risk their lives transmitting that information. Intelligence officers in London chose to recognize its importance and push it to operational commanders. General Gavin chose to adjust his plans based on that intelligence, and thousands of individual paratroopers chose to carry out their missions despite knowing the risks. Each of these decisions involved uncertainty. Christian could not know whether the train observations would ever prove useful. Resistance couriers could not know if the information they carried would reach anyone who could act on it. Intelligence officers could not be certain their analysis was correct. General Gavin could not eliminate the risks his soldiers faced. But they all chose to act based on their best judgment of what was necessary and right. This human element is often lost in historical accounts that focus on statistics, strategies, and outcomes. We discuss operations and divisions and objectives as if they exist independently of the individuals who conceived, planned, and executed them. But history is made by people making choices under conditions of incomplete information, time pressure, and physical danger. The story of the train schedules reminds us that individual actions matter. One person's patient observation contributed to saving thousands of lives. One intelligence officer's insistence that a report receive proper attention changed how a division planned its mission. One general's willingness to revise plans based on new information made the difference between success and catastrophe. We cannot know all the individual stories from Market Garden. Most resistance members never received recognition. Most soldiers who fought and were lost have no individual memorials, but collectively their choices and actions determined the outcome. And some of those choices, like Christian's decision to watch trains, seem ordinary until we understand their consequences. The broader context Operation Market Garden was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger campaign to defeat Nazi Germany and liberate occupied Europe. That campaign involved millions of soldiers, thousands of operations, and countless individual decisions and actions. Intelligence work, like Christian's observations, was a small but necessary part of this enormous effort. The war in Europe would continue for another 8 months after Market Garden. The winter of 1944-1945 brought some of the hardest fighting of the entire war. The Battle of the Bulge in December, the crossing of the Rhine in March, the final drive into Germany. Victory, when it came in May 1945, was the result of accumulated efforts over years. The Netherlands, particularly the western provinces that remained under occupation until the very end, endured terrible hardship during that final winter. Food became scarce, fuel was almost non-existent. Thousands of civilians perished from starvation and cold in what became known as the Hunger Winter. The failure to liberate the entire country in September 1944 meant prolonged suffering for the Dutch population. This reality adds a bitter note to any discussion of Market Garden. The operation's failure had consequences beyond military casualties. It meant months of additional occupation suffering and loss for Dutch civilians who had hoped liberation was imminent. The resistance members who had provided intelligence, risking everything to support the Allied operation, watched their country remain under Nazi control through another brutal winter. Yet the intelligence work continued. The resistance networks that had supplied information before Market Garden kept operating. They documented German defensive preparations. They helped Allied airmen who were shot down. They sabotaged infrastructure when possible. And they prepared for the final liberation that would eventually come. The story of Christian and the train schedules is therefore part of a larger story of resistance, persistence, and ultimately, victory. It represents the thousands of individual contributions that, combined together, made the Allied victory possible. Not every contribution changed the course of the war, but each one mattered to someone. And some, like the intelligence that helped save the 82nd Airborne Division, had impacts that rippled through the rest of the campaign. Lessons learned, the military lessons from the Market Garden intelligence story have been studied extensively. Modern military doctrine emphasizes the importance of reconnaissance and intelligence before operations. The failures to adequately assess German strength before Market Garden are used as cautionary examples in military education. But there are broader lessons as well, about the value of methodical work, about the importance of listening to warnings even when they contradict your preferences, about the need to respect intelligence sources, especially human sources operating under dangerous conditions, and about the reality that wars are won through accumulated small advantages, not just dramatic breakthroughs. The Market Garden operation is often cited as an example of overconfidence leading to flawed planning. Senior commanders wanted to believe that German forces were beaten and that a bold strike could end the war quickly. Intelligence that contradicted this optimistic view was downplayed or ignored. The result was an operation that asked too much of the forces involved and achieved less than hoped. Yet within that flawed operation, there were examples of how to do things right. The 82nd Airborne Division succeeded in its mission because it paid attention to intelligence. General Gavin adjusted his plans based on what the information suggested about enemy strength. His soldiers executed their mission with skill and courage, but they were not asked to accomplish the impossible because their leaders had realistic expectations about what they faced. This balance between optimism and realism remains a challenge in military planning. Operations require confidence and determination, but they also require honest assessment of enemy capabilities and realistic evaluation of what is achievable. Intelligence work, like Christian's trained schedules, provides the information necessary for that realistic assessment. Whether commanders choose to use that information wisely is another matter. The invisible veterans. After the war, the veterans of Market Garden came home to parades and recognition. Their service was honored, their sacrifices acknowledged. Monuments were built, ceremonies were held. The military cemeteries in the Netherlands became places of pilgrimage for those who wanted to understand what had happened there. But the resistance members, the intelligence sources, the people like Christian, who had contributed to the operation's partial success, largely returned to obscurity. Many never spoke publicly about their wartime activities. Some were bound by official secrets acts. Others simply wanted to move on with their lives and leave the war behind. This pattern was common throughout occupied Europe. The resistance members who had risked everything to support the Allied cause received limited recognition. Their work was classified, their identities were protected, and gradually, as the years passed and the focus shifted to Cold War concerns, their contributions faded from public memory. Only in recent decades have historians begun to fully document and recognize the extent of resistance intelligence work during World War II. Archives have opened, documents have been declassified. Surviving resistance members and their families have been willing to share their stories, and the picture that emerges is of a sophisticated and effective intelligence network that operated under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Christian represents thousands of individuals who made similar contributions. We may never know all their names. We may never fully understand all that they did. But we can acknowledge that they existed, that their work mattered, and that the course of history was changed by their decisions to act. They are the invisible veterans of the war, not soldiers in uniform, not members of regular military organizations, but participants nonetheless, who faced dangers as real as any battlefield and made sacrifices as meaningful as any soldiers. Their weapon was information. Their battlefield was occupied territory, and their victory was measured not in ground captured, but in lives saved and operations supported. Conclusion, September 1944. A person sits with a notebook, watching trains, recording times, directions, contents, day after day, week after week, patient, methodical, thorough. To any casual observer, this would seem pointless, boring, a waste of time. But those train schedules told a story. They revealed that German forces were not as weak as Allied commanders hoped. They showed that reinforcements were arriving, equipment was being concentrated, and defenses were being strengthened. They provided information that, transmitted through dangerous channels and analyzed by experienced officers, changed how 10,000 American paratroopers approached their mission. The bridges at Nijmegen were captured because soldiers were brave and skilled. But they were captured at an acceptable cost because those soldiers had intelligence that allowed them to plan realistically and fight effectively. They knew what they faced because someone had watched trains and understood what those observations meant. This is not the way we usually think about heroism. There are no dramatic moments in watching trains, no stirring speeches, no charges into enemy fire. Just patience, attention to detail, and a belief that small observations can have large consequences. But that belief was correct. The train schedules mattered. The intelligence reached the right people at the right time. The plans were adjusted. The mission succeeded. And thousands of soldiers who might have been lost lived to continue the fight. Operation at Market Garden failed to achieve its ultimate objective. The bridge at Arnhem was indeed too far. But the bridges at Nijmegen were not. They were captured in 4 hours by paratroopers who had the advantage of knowing what they faced. And that knowledge began with something as ordinary as a train schedule. In the history of World War II, there are many stories of heroism and sacrifice. But there are also stories of quiet competence, methodical work, and patient intelligence gathering. These stories are less dramatic, but they are no less important. They remind us that wars are won through accumulated advantages, that information is a weapon as important as any gun, and that the most ordinary observations can have extraordinary consequences. Christian watched trains, and because of that, 10,000 soldiers completed their mission and survived to fight again. In the calculus of war, where every life matters and every advantage counts, that train schedule was worth more than gold. The next time you see something ordinary, something that seems too mundane to matter, remember that context changes meaning. A train schedule is just a schedule until it reveals enemy intentions. An observation is just a fact until it informs a decision, and a quiet person watching and recording might be changing history, one boring detail at a time. This is the story of how patience defeated panic, how details changed destiny, and how the most boring intelligence work in World War II saved 10,000 lives and secured 2 critical bridges in 4 hours. It is a reminder that in war, as in life, small things observed carefully can reveal great truths, and sometimes the most important hero is the one nobody sees.